So, Adobe Illustrator comes with a number of features out of the box that are not necessarily all set up the way I like them. The first thing I do, generally speaking, when I start a new document is I go to the Effect tab and I click on Document Raster Effects Settings. You'll see this document is set up for print, so it's CMYK. It comes with a 300 ppi resolution preset, and it has anti-aliasing turned off. Now, there may be certain benefits to that, but I generally speaking do not like my artwork to be anti-aliased unless I specifically want it to be. The resolution is set at 300 ppi. Now, every raster effect that you apply, everything pretty much under the effects heading, will require rendering as raster, which means that if you have it set at 300 ppi, you're roughly using, I think, 4 times the space that you would if you set it at 150 ppi. This is something that you can change later on. Remember, you're working in a vector environment, so things remain very fluid that way. So you may want to choose to set your raster effects to medium until you get ready to output your stuff. For the web, generally speaking, 150 is better than working in 72 ppi because you, in spite of the fact that you will be outputting in 72 ppi, actually should be dpi, you will have a hard time seeing what's going on your screen. Stuff will just look too blurry for properly working in. So 150 seems to be the default that works best, generally speaking. Another thing that you need to be aware of that can really start to mess with you is it adds 1/2 inch around an object. Especially if you decide on a very high resolution, that is going to add tremendously to the size of your object. It will also impact how your object is perceived within the stack of objects on a layer in Illustrator, and it may cause your object to align in unexpected ways. Create clipping mask, I just leave that alone. Generally speaking, you're not going to really want that. So we're hitting OK here. Finally, we're on our way. No, not quite. In the Pathfinder palette, there's another step you need to take. You go to Pathfinder Options. You set the precision to 0.1 points. I've just decided that that's, for me, seems to be a very good setting. This precision determines how precise your Pathfinder is going to glue objects together when it makes compound paths. And 0.01 seems to give you better results than 0.028. These two are fairly important. Remove redundant points when you glue two objects together and there are a number of anchors along the edge that happen to be very close together. It will not delete any of them, and you will have a bunch of excess anchors that you really don't want. Divide and outline will remove unpainted artwork. Is very helpful when you go to slice into things and you want stuff to just go away. Unpainted artwork to go away. Hit OK on that. So now we're finally ready to go. So we have our little piece of text here. I used Impact because that's like your generic meme font that you're going to want to do stuff with the stroke around. And I have these boxes in the background that are not going to become relevant until later because I want to see what's happening to my object, not only on a white background, because we're going to be working with a white fill, but also on a colored background and how that transition looks, because that will give me the best impression of what it is that I'm actually looking at. So I'm going to select this text and we're going to give it a white fill. And we'll select the stroke here. You can also select the stroke right there. You just bring that little panel to the foreground, see they switch out. And then we're going to add a black fill. We can get a standard black 100% K fill from right there, or stroke, pardon me, from right there. Now we have a nice stroke around the outside of our letters. So that's still all fine and dandy, but here's where the first idiosyncrasy comes in. Obviously, these fonts are made up of vector paths that are being projected as individual glyphs. And if you start to add a little bit more stroke there, very soon you will start to see that, for instance, the letter A gets a really ugly point on it. Now, that's caused by two paths that have a corner that is too pointy, essentially, for the stroke to wrap around neatly. So the stroke keeps going for a while, and then it goes down again on the other side. So you can see the stroke, there's excess stroke there. If I add another point, God forbid, I'll probably poke, the top of my monitor. So you can see that that doesn't really work out so well. So this is called a miter. And in vector world, a miter is essentially just a sharp point. And right here, there's a number in your stroke palette that says limit. And if I make that a little smaller, see, right on the first, making it smaller, already that tip is gone. There's still a tip right here, though, on the R. So if I keep going down with my miter limit, I can remove all of these points. Now, of course, it still doesn't look right because you have a stroke here that is 3 points. That's pretty much covering up some parts of your white. So you say, well, how do we get that stroke to go to the back? Big secret. Well, let me tell you how to do that. If you go to the appearance palette, which is going to be the star of this episode, you can see there it says type, and then underneath type it says characters. If you double click on that, it will open up. It'll start looking all funky over here. It will open up and it'll tell you there's your stroke and there's your fill. You're like, all right, well, in the appearance palette you can move line items around, so I'll just drag my stroke down a bunch behind the fill. Hey, I thought you could do that. Well, guess what? With text you can't. So we're going to take a completely different approach here. We're going to throw out our stroke and we're going to throw out our fill under characters. Then we're going to go to our type object and we're going to add a new fill. And it immediately comes with a little stroke attached to it. And see right here, the characters palette, the character line item will still show no stroke and no fill. There is no stroke and no fill on the type anymore. But we do have, on the characters, but we do have stroke and fill on the type itself as an object. And this is a point type object, meaning that it starts from one anchor. It's not inside of a container. So what we're going to do now, obviously we have our fill. We wanted that to be white. Now, just for being able to work quickly, Illustrator does have these palettes that pop out that allow you to do the same thing, to select a color from there. These are all context-based. So if I click right here, then I'll get a stroke palette. But they're smaller than the usual ones, but they're functional nonetheless. So let's make our stroke a little more beefy again. So now we're back under the same situation. So we've gotten rid of all of our points sticking out, but it still looks like not too good. So what we really want is to make our stroke fatter, but to keep the integrity of the actual insides of the letters. Now that we've freed this up and these are actual strokes and fills, we can grab this stroke right here and drag it until we're all the way below the fill. So now we see that they've actually switched places here. Your stroke is below your fill. And now it all looks a heck of a lot better. In fact, it's almost comfortable enough to add 2 or 3 more points. And still, the insides of our letters look pretty decent. Now I hear you say, but what if I want to knock out the insides of letters? And this is a big deal because you come across this a lot. Like, what if I want knockouts? Because, see, if I didn't have my green panel here, this would already look like knocked out letters. But I do have my green panel there. And I want these letters to be see-through in the middle. That shouldn't be too hard. So let's select our letters again. And let's just delete our fill. Oh, God, look at that. That's just no good. So that's not the approach. So Control-Z, very helpful. And actually, this is something that I'm about to tell you is extremely important, and I've forgotten about it for too long already, but Control-S regularly. Illustrator does not have an autosave feature that I've ever been aware of, and therefore you must be in the habit of regularly saving your files. Anyway, so we were going to knock out the center of these letters, and we know that that didn't work. So here's a special feature in Illustrator. There's the knockout group feature. Now, something doesn't have to be part of a group to be looked at as a group. I have a single text object here. For all intents and purposes, you could call that a group of one. Now, because it's a group of one, see this in your transparency palette, there's this thing that says knockout group. You click on it once and it has a minus sign. I still haven't figured out after 20 years, well, it hasn't been there for 20 years, or what that does. But if you click on it twice and it turns into a check mark, that means that front objects inside the group can knock out objects behind it. Now, objects taken very loosely, this particular fill should be able to knock out that particular stroke. Now, this doesn't mean anything to you yet, but if I show you how it works, it will become very interesting. So, we select our object. Actually, I think I have my opacity applied in the wrong place, but let me check here real quick. Yeah, it's in the wrong place. So, I need to throw that in the trash if I can. And I need to make sure that my type object is selected properly. Now, this is a common pitfall that you're actually going to run into, but if you have line items selected inside of your appearance palette, then anything that you do will apply to that particular line item. I just applied my little magic trick to the wrong line item. That's why it was never going to work. So it already didn't look right. So I'm going to select the top here, type, because that's what I want to be working on. I want to be working at the very top here. And then I'm going to say, click twice there, say knockout group. Now I'm going to go to my fill. Now, as you can see, these all have drop-down arrows. You can fold that stuff up. If the appearance palette gets long, you want to fold a lot of those up until you need to modify something. So I'm going to now say my opacity for the fill is going to be 0%. As you can see, my white has now disappeared, but it's actually knocked out the parts of the black that I did not want. Now, the main reason I know that is because of my green box. Because let's go back a step. Now let's do the exact same thing again. Insides are invisible, but my green box is gone, so you wouldn't know. That's why I frequently, when I'm working with objects that need to be knocked out, I like to have something behind it so that I can see what's actually going on. So, so there you have it. So let's go forward a couple of steps again. Control-Shift-Z is a very handy adjunct to Control-Z. In Illustrator 4, there was only one Control-Z. So I learned with that, and I learned very quickly that you don't want to go more than a step or two before saving your file, because Control-Z was going to punish you. So now we have our knocked out object. Here's our text, and you can see right through the letters. The appearance palette obviously has numerous other features. You can have, as far as I know, an unlimited number of strokes. You can add new stroke here, or you can, wait a minute, let's go to the top. Yeah, so you can add a stroke right here, add a new stroke. Bam, they just added a new stroke, but it adds it right on top. So let's move this stroke to the back. So now it's in the back. It's exactly the same width as our other stroke. And it's in exactly the same place. So much good is that going to do us? So let's make the other stroke a little narrower. This one too. So we've made them both narrower now. Now that I have this line item selected, I'm going to go to Effect. I'm going to go to Distort and Transform. I'm going to hit Transform. And I'm going to transform this by, let's start with about 2 pixels. I do a lot of web stuff, so I tend to think in pixels, and 2 pixels down. Let's turn on the preview. So what we just did is we took our fat stroke. It's fat enough to get away with this. We may have to add a fill if we wanted to move it over much further, because as you can see, for instance, like let's make this 0.05 inches. So you can see now I can look through the insides of these letters, and that's not necessarily desirable. But I only want to take them, move them over so much. So let's move them over 0.02 inches. Just there. So now we have a nice drop shadow, which is live, which means that we can still make adjustments to the text because it's all still live text. And there are a number of other things you can do from here. Remember, we're only applying this to this particular stroke. So say I scale everything up by 1% horizontally. Then, because it measures from the middle, you're seeing this moving over to the left over here and moving over to the right over here too far. But it could be a desirable effect. Now, if I say, well, yeah, I'm okay with that. I like how it kind of has a shadow on both sides. Obviously, we have our little open holes in there because we don't have a fill. So let's do this. Let's grab this fill and make a new one out of it. Now, we know this fill has a 0% opacity, so let's first fix that. That won't work because it is directly behind this fill, so it's still going to be knocked out. We're okay with that though. And we're okay with that because, let me just tear this off here. You can tear off these palettes when they get a little out of hand. So I can show you the whole thing. So we now have our fill that's knocking out the centers. We have our fill that's our new fill. Might as well make it black because I want it to be black ultimately. We have our first stroke, which is the narrow stroke around the letters. We have our second stroke, which is the one that we just scaled. Now this fill obviously needs to go all the way to the bottom. We also want this fill to have the exact same distortion that this stroke does. So here's another little trick. You drag it over, you hold down the Alt key, and then you drop it. So now I've applied this same effect to my fill that I had on my stroke. And as a result, I now have these letters that look pretty decent if you like that kind of shadows. Obviously, this is applied across the entire object. So when I have my transform effects set up, hey, my appearance palette went into hiding. I don't like that. Come on out. There we go. All right, so let's move that over here again. So if I look at my transform effect, because these are all live effects, I can still modify it. And I have it at 103%. I think that might be a little much. So I'm going to go to 102%. I'm going to click my anchor right here on the left-hand side. Let's turn preview on. So you just saw it move. You didn't see all too much move because there's still that black fill that's kind of messing with us. We're going to do the exact same thing to this fill. This one. So remember 102% and put our anchor on the left-hand side. Show the preview. And as you can see now, our shadow starts aligned neatly behind the letter and then gradually like walks out of the way. Now obviously this would be too easy. You can do a number of other things. Obviously the transform palette had that rotation in it. So let's see what that does. Oh my goodness. Awesome. So before I go completely nuts, this is about all that I wanted to show you in this first little overview of some basics that have to do with text. Let me think for a second if there's anything else that I could tell you that may be extremely helpful with things like text. Just knowing that you are not dependent on a, a character's color to achieve all these things, that you can treat a, a, a font like or a text object like a vector object, but you have to bring your stuff outside of this box. One more thing that I can show you, I guess, is say you wanted to apply some kind of an effect to this object. So say I want to apply a drop shadow because I love drop shadows. I'm just a sucker for drop shadows. So I've selected my line item that I'm going to apply my drop shadow to. That's my 3-point stroke. That's sitting behind everything, and it has the transformation applied to it already. I'm going to my effect palette here, and I'm going to go to blur, and I'm going to pick Gaussian blur. I'm going to put a radius on there. 2 pixels is probably not bad to start with. It looks okay. Then I'm going to hit OK. So we have our drop shadow. Now, there's something about these drop shadows that always is a little irksome, is that when you first make them, they don't really look like a shadow at all. So in order to avoid that, with your same line item still selected, you set the opacity to multiply. And now the shadow multiplies into the background color, meaning that it essentially becomes one color on top of the other, numerically speaking, and it turns into the background color but darker, or the background color melded with whatever the foreground color is. In this case, that's black, and so it makes the green darker instead of showing you a lighter shade of black against a green background here. So now we have a little drop shadow on there. I can show you something else. Let's make our drop shadow extremely exaggerated. For the case of this example, we're going to make our Gaussian blur 54 pixels. It's going to take a little while. Did that not work? That's very odd. Oh, I had no selection. Well, this should be a lot more successful. So let's make our blur ridiculously large. Give it a second. Okay, now you can't even really see the outlines of the blur anymore. But what you can see on the left-hand side is exactly what I wanted to point out to you. See how the blur runs into a wall here, and it doesn't extend until it's 0 all the way. This is where the effect settings come in. And as you can see, I told you earlier, adding half-inch around object, generally the default setting seems to work okay. But in this particular case, it doesn't seem to work because our blur wants to extend past a half-inch. If you measure this, this would be a half-inch, would be my guess. So, in this case, what we can do is either make our drop shadow a little bit less ridiculously big, or we can change this to 1 inch, for instance. Then that takes a second to process, and voila, all of a sudden, we don't run into our little wall anymore. Conversely, if we want to save space, and memory space particularly, and if we want to have things process a little quicker, if I were to know ahead of time that I was absolutely not going to apply any effects that extended beyond maybe 5 pixels around the object, I could make that added space around the object, 5 pixels, 6 pixels, 10 pixels. I just don't know that for sure. And because this applies to all raster effects, not just to a blur, you have to be careful with this setting. I generally tend to leave it at a 1/2 inch, but let's say we make it 0.1 inches. Okay. What we're going to see here is that our object cuts off right around the outside. And we don't necessarily want that to happen. Or maybe we do. It's just something that you need to be aware of. So let's take this Gaussian blur, now not the transform, the Gaussian blur, and let's take it back down to, yeah, let's say that like 3.1. Set it 4. No, not 10. Okay. How about 4? No, we'll leave it at 3. And there we go. Let's see, our result is adequately terrible, but I hope you learned a couple of things from all my ranting along the way. Thanks. Bye.